Even after everything we talked about regarding the Overman in the last episode, there is still sort of a question that may remain, or a riddle. At least that was how I experienced it when I first encountered these ideas. It's not entirely clear how the idea of the Overman works together with eternal recurrence, how the ideas don't end up becoming mutually exclusive. This is a common problem with Nietzsche, because he sees both sides of many issues, and the result is that he perceives a number of paradoxes in the way that we think, that we might not normally perceive. And so some of his ideas are intended to address paradoxes that we don't even know that we capitulate to in our reasoning. And so I'll explain what I mean. One of those things is what we might call the paradox of meaning. So in Nietzsche's quest to forge a new meaning, a new table of values for mankind, he runs up against this fundamental problem. On the one hand, we only have this one life to live. We are compelled by mortality to spend only a temporary amount of time on this earth before life leaves us. And man previously dealt with that problem by inventing afterworlds. And as we've talked about, Nietzsche rejects this because such a solution ends up moving the value that we invest into our actual lives into an imagined afterlife, and thus it devalues life as a means. It's a means of dealing with the problem of death, which is a part of life, but the result is you end up devaluing life as a whole, which was unacceptable to Nietzsche because we can't deal with the problem of death and impermanence in such a way as to devalue the very thing we're trying to protect or even elevate the value of, right? And that's life itself. So Nietzsche's looking for this solution, but he runs up against this problem again. So Nietzsche, when he attempts a solution, it's the rejection of these essential categories of being. That's sort of what his solution to the problem of meaning or the problem of life, whatever I've called it variously, is since the start of season 2. He begins by rejecting the idea of the self as a stable, consistent entity with duration. He recharacterizes life as a play of multiple forces which are always dynamic. He says, along with Heraclitus, one of his influences, that duration is an illusion, and our attempts to categorize things or represent the world in terms of numeric values or quantities is simply a linguistic lie by which we equate unequal things. And he brings up this problem all the way back on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, and again in Human All Too Human, and again in Beyond Good and Evil. So I think we can safely say this is a perennial critique in Nietzsche's philosophy that I think comes directly from Heraclitus. It's an attack on categories of being. Now, these categories of being may be a lie, but they're a necessary lie for the purposes of comprehending reality at all. But it's the key thing is these categories are not an eternal fact of reality. They're a falsification of reality created by the human mind. If we were to, this is where things get tricky, right? Because that's part of perspectivism, is that it's a truly a necessary illusion. That means you have to inhabit one of these perspectives. You have to falsify reality in some way. And there is no absolute perspective by which we can, behold the world without one of these lenses. And yet Nietzsche still makes claims about ontology, right? Because what is left, the thing is, he normally makes these claims in his unpublished notes, right? But he talks about how instead of being, we have becoming. Instead of duration and static categories, we have a dynamic reality, like Heraclitus's ever-living fire, a constant process of things arising and passing away. And the fact is that things have never ceased from arising and passing away. Change is the rule. Motion is the true reality. Stasis is a necessary fiction. And from this is where we, I think, get the impetus for Nietzsche's critiques on language, why he thinks there may perhaps be no opposites at all, similar to the criticism of opposites that we find implied in Heraclitus. And so this is why Nietzsche rejects essential differences between good and evil, truth and untruth, and so on and so forth. These may simply be gradations, different manifestations of the same underlying force or drive. And so in such a world, death is no longer the problem we thought it was. I think this is Nietzsche's insight, because we ourselves will merely transform into something else, some other part of the ever-living fire. This is sort of similar to how when Schopenhauer says, if a man really perceives the true nature of the world as will, death will no longer trouble him. He'll see it's an unreal phantasm, right? And so in truth, all living things give rise to offshoots and transformations of themselves. So in the case of human beings, we have children, or if we're artists and philosophers or holy men, we create beyond ourselves in the world of art or ideas or spirit. In short, we do not live for the sake of preserving ourselves, but for generating something new, something greater, hopefully, something which is beyond ourselves. We find meaning not by preserving our lives as they are now, but by becoming something new, by overcoming ourselves as we are now. And so this picture of the world as becoming allows Nietzsche, or gives Nietzsche the insight to reorient the way that he thinks about life as a way of taking on the problem of life without falling victim to the past mistakes, past pitfalls of just inventing afterworlds. But there's still, this is the fundamental paradox that I mentioned before that I think Nietzsche runs up against, because the value is still likely to be moved from the life that we're living now into a distant future of our imagination. If becoming is the ultimate character of reality, and we should live in such a way as to produce offshoots of ourselves, create beyond ourselves, why should we not then invest all our hopes, all that is sacred, all value into the future, right? Why shouldn't we not devalue the lives that we're living now if the life that we're living now is merely a means to an end? And this has always been the danger with the Overman ideal. Nietzsche seems to be suggesting that the value, there's this ideal image, right, that's in this infinitely far off future, which we'll never live to see. And even those who take the Overman idea quite literally, which I don't, but some do, they may have to reckon with the fact that if the Overman is supposed to be the next biological, evolutionary phase of mankind, that's something that's going to be millions of years into the future. And so it can't possibly concern us now. And by the way, I don't deny there is a biological element to all this, even if it isn't the whole story. Living in such a way as to give rise to something greater than yourself does include the idea of giving rise to actual offspring. And this is what ensures the survival and betterment of the species. But if that is the thing for which we're living, some future iteration of man that's millions of years away, such that it isn't something you will experience, not even something your grandkids or great-grandkids or descendants 50 generations from now will even experience, once again, the danger is the value begins to leak out of this life, leak out of the present, and accumulate in someplace else, some future, which can only exist, at least for the time being, in the imagination. And so now we can consider the second prong of Nietzsche's strategy for returning meaning to the world we live in, and for the individual lives that we each experience to have value again, and that's the eternal recurrence. The highest expression of the philosophical will to power, as Nietzsche discusses it in his notes, is to dare to transform becoming into being, to render an image in the Apollonian sense, a representation of what the world as becoming, quote, looks like. How can we conceive of the roil of competing forces that make up our reality? And thus we have this sort of bold experiment that Nietzsche then embarks on to take the idea of eternal repetition, endless repetition, the eternally cyclical, and interpose it with arising and passing away, the mortality, the temporality that characterizes life and characterizes life's tragedies, such that we live our individual lives in which we suffer from the calamities of everything we love eventually passing away, and we have to confront the fact that eventually our own lives pass away. But with this idea of eternal return of the same, we hold to the faith that it will all come back to us again, exactly the same as before. Everything is too beautiful to me to be fleeting, Nietzsche writes. Should we pour the most valuable wines and salves into the sea? The sea shall cast it back up again. Eternal return. So this poses a test to us in the form of the toughest challenge we've ever faced. Can I wish for the endless repetition of my life, as I have lived it, of the endless repetition of everything that has ever happened in all history even? Because all of that is necessary for my life to play out as it is. Do I wish to eternalize my own story? Is it worth that much? So Nietzsche's insight here is that when we value, we're seeking the eternity of the thing that we're valuing on some level. We want it to last forever. To say yes to something is to say yes for all eternity. And so that's how we keep the value from leaking out of this life then. We make this life last forever. We dare to wish for an eternity of this life. But if we look at eternal return in a vacuum, there's also an immediate problem with this, because the trouble is that duration coupled with an in vain, as Nietzsche writes in his notes, which you can find in Will to Power, it's the ultimate torture. It's Sisyphean. The pointlessness of one's suffering becomes unbearable when paired with duration, not to speak of an infinite duration. It's why in the passage The Greatest Weight, Nietzsche asks whether, if you were confronted by some magical being with the secret knowledge of eternal return, would you call this being a demon, or would you call it a god and a savior, right? If we accept the idea of eternal recurrence of the same, just on its own, there's actually no chance in the eternal recurrence for human beings to give rise to something beyond themselves or greater than themselves, right? And that takes away the component of meaning. And so all we've done is invented a new hell to torture ourselves in, if that's the case. If we just have the eternal recurrence, what makes our lives valuable and meaningful, giving rise to something new, isn't possible. And so, we will end up just living lives of meaningless drudgery that end in pointlessness. That it's absurdity, right? And so we have a quandary. On the one hand, we have to keep the value invested in this life, the one life we'll ever know or experience. On the other, we have to part with this life eventually. We all know that. And we have to give rise to something beyond ourselves if we are to have meaning. Without which, giving our lives eternality will just be a torment, right? If that other element isn't there. So ought the focus be placed in the future or in the moment? That's another way of putting this problem. And you'll notice in the various interpretations of Nietzsche out there, there's sort of a bipolar interpretation of his take on this, sometimes even in the same interpreter, right? Because there are passages you could read out of context, which might suggest either that Nietzsche is for living in the now, which does tend to be the more popular version of interpreting Nietzsche. But then you'll also see interpretations, well, Nietzsche's writing for the future, all the value should be in the future. Obviously the living in the now is more popular in our society. And I'm not saying this to reflect badly on Nietzsche, but of course that kind of idea will find purchase because, in the modern hedonistic West, where people are racked by highest levels of anxiety and depression and all this like guilt and everything, what's better than living in the now, right? Not thinking about the future consequences of your actions, not thinking about all that's in the past that you have to feel guilty about. And so, I don't deny that's an element of Nietzsche's, religious project, but there's a reason why common interpretations ignore the idea of Untergehen, or going under. The passages where Nietzsche praises voluntarily dying, squandering your soul for some cause beyond you, because they just can't conceive of such a thing in an atheistic world. Why would you want to go under to bring on something greater than yourself if it's all about me right now? And I guess what I'm saying here is I think the live in the now element is there, but unless you bring in what we talked about last time, it's right there at the beginning of the book, the very strong message of being willing to yield up your life, go under. Literally die, but basically accept your downfall and go into that good night when your time has come, in the name of something that will exist after you. That's not you. right? Something that is hopefully greater than you, or an offshoot of you, but it's not really you, right? That Untergehen element is often not included with like the libertine, individualist, live in the now interpretations of Nietzsche. They don't really touch it because I don't think they know what to do with it. I don't think they know what it means. So to a lot of people, they maybe don't even perceive this paradox of meaning. They just take from Nietzsche, live in the now, which I don't think that's true. In fact, I think it is this paradox of meaning that makes this necessary harmony of these two beliefs, eternal recurrence and the Overman, necessary. And so, with the eternal return doctrine, it's an attempt to make the bitter pill of mortality hard to swallow, or easier to swallow, rather. I'm sorry. Nietzsche talks often about how the ideal life is lived by one who throws himself into death willingly, saying, was that life? Well then, once more. It's like we should live our lives like an innocent child who gets off the ride and says, again, right? And so the secret here, it's easier to live in a way that's carefree towards death if you don't fear some potentially terrible afterworld, or the idea of eternal nothingness, or you're not troubled by the incomprehensibility of non-being or whatever it might be. And so this is why eternal return, this is why Nietzsche writes that it's for the strong, right? And it paralyzes and breaks the weak. It's only appropriate for the type of person who will take this message and use it. They'll take the message wholeheartedly and use it properly. That in the light of this sort of falseness of death, the falseness of temporality, one can then die in a carefree and noble manner, blessing life without clinging to it. And by that token, they can more effectively live in such a way as to give rise to something greater than themselves. And that means living in a way that's not self-preservative, but in a way of self-overcoming. And so embracing the eternal return idea, you make a life possible in which you can give rise to the ultimate value, that is the Overman. Living for the Overman idea, you make it so a life lived of infinite duration and infinite repetition is actually not in vain in this strange way. Even though they seem opposed, these two ideas take in concert, they create a splendid harmony. And this is, in my opinion, to summarize the great revelation of Zarathustra in the passage, The Convalescent, that the abysmal thought of eternal return, the eternality of everything small and contemptible in mankind, because that's what's required by eternal return, everything negative as well as positive returns eternally, the way of defeating that abysmal thought is with the Overman. The idea that if all that is all too human must return again and again, then so too must all that is great in man, infinitely great, the infinite potential inside each of us, which is sort of symbolized by the Overman, that eternally returns too. And so with our faith in the Overman, we come to believe it's not the case that greatness within mankind may be realized at some potential future date, but rather it's realized eternally. And, it's forever. By having faith that mankind will continue to be an ascending form of life, a life pattern that moves in the direction of the Overman rather than the last man, we eternally redeem mankind in the here and now. We redeem our own lives in the here and now. It's, again, ties back to that very important line that create yourself in such a way that you will give rise to the Overman and let that recreation of yourself be your greatest creation. And so it's the holding of these two apparently exclusive ideas simultaneously of the value being in the moment and the value being in the future. And Nietzsche does this by creating this doctrine of limits, right? Infinity is a limit. So the Overman is infinitely above mankind, and eternal return is infinite repetition of our lives. And so with these two limits, they sort of, the two lines intersect, right? And that's Nietzsche's Dionysian religion. Zarathustra gives a series of teachings preliminary to the revelation of how the Overman and the Eternal Recurrence idea work together. This is a very long chapter broken into 30 sections known as On Old and New Tables. This is the chapter just before the Convalescent. So it's sort of the background context of the main text I want to talk about today, which is the chapter The Convalescent. But I wanted to just sort of bring up the things that Zarathustra is teaching right before this scene. And keep in mind, this is in Book 3, so all the things we talked about in the Eternal Return episodes, that has transpired as well. Zarathustra's seen the vision and the riddle of the serpent who bites through the abysmal thought, right? The black snake that bites into his neck and is transfigured into something new. So he writes in section 2 of Old and New Tables or Tablets. I think it could be translated either way. But he's speaking of all mankind here. Quote, I raised a hue and a cry of wrath over what among them is great and small, and that their best is still so small, and that their greatest evil, too, is still so small. At that I laughed. End quote. In the very next section of this chapter, carrying forward from this reiteration of the smallness and all too human nature of mankind, Nietzsche repeats in very clear terms exactly what is meant by the concept of the Overman, that it's not a literal individual or somebody who's already existed in history or something that we literally become. He says very plainly what it is symbolic of here in section 3. Quote, there it was, too, that I picked up the word Overman, by the way. That man is something that must be overcome. That man is a bridge and no end, proclaiming himself blessed in his view of his noon and evening as the way to new dawns. Zarathustra's word of the great noon, and whatever else I hung up over man like the last crimson light of evening. End quote. So he states it here. Overman means that man is to be overcome, that we are a bridge to something greater. We should be willing to bless ourselves as those who go under, the way that a sun sets. Remember, it's the same word in German. It's the sun sets to allow for a new dawn. Zarathustra is the preacher of noon, saying that what is great in man is that we're halfway between beast and overman. He elaborates a little further down, quote, I taught them to work on the future and to redeem with their creation all that has been, to redeem what is past in man and to recreate all of it until the will says, thus I willed it, thus I shall will it. This I called redemption, and this alone I taught them to call redemption. End quote. And so we have the sort of refrain throughout this, that this is of that element of it, right, of placing the value of mankind in the future. The value of what we are is in what we shall become. And again, I should just say, this apparent contradiction, this apparent paradox that I've based this whole episode on, what you are going to start to realize as we continue on, it's only an apparent contradiction in language, which is why Nietzsche criticizes these opposite categories, and it's one of the reasons why I brought that up at the beginning. But because when you say it in those terms, it's the value of what we are is within the value of what we become. But so there's a sense here in which the events of the future recreate the past. Our view of ourselves and our future gives us a different view of our own past. And he uses the word redemption here. I mean, one of the ways Nietzsche talks about this great task of his is the task of redeeming mankind. Sometimes he says justifying or elevating, but here he's talking about redemption. We have the sense that by recreating ourselves and reorienting our view of the future, we redeem the past by that token. And that's the sole sense, he says, in which we should understand redemption. So it's not a repayment of some karmic debt. It's not the Lamb of God repaying your debt of sinfulness, as if the past is an actual, weight or force that exerts its gravity on us today that has to be sort of dealt with or unloaded or traded for or paid for in some way, but simply by recreating ourselves. In the same section, he references the spirit of gravity, his old arch enemy and devil, And what was the spirit of gravity? It was the voice of necessity of one's downfall, the necessity of all that is coarse, embarrassing, shameful, heavy about mankind. Nietzsche's defiance to this is the idea that these feelings and assessments are all dependent on the life that we create and the future that we help bring forth. We have the power to reevaluate who we are. We can become different people. We can turn our eyes to the future in order to redeem the past. We don't have to remain slaves to sin or karma or whatever. Throughout this passage, in which Zarathustra purports to give us new tablets of value on which to base our lives, he continually returns to the idea, making ourselves creators and cultivators of the future. And he often brings up the endless flux of all things, aiming for distant goals, aiming for far horizons. And at the very end of the sermon, Zarathustra concludes by calling himself, quote, a bow lusting for its arrow, an arrow lusting for its star, a star ready and ripe in its noon, glowing, pierced, enraptured by annihilating sun arrows. A sun itself, and an inexorable solar will, ready to annihilate in victory. End quote. And so in these preachments, there's the continuing theme, in addition to Zarathustra's attacks on morality and the rejection of the good and the just, which occur throughout that passage. We have this idea, the redemption that man finds within the goal of overcoming ourselves. Zarathustra once again uses the language of the arrow of longing. And so, I don't know, just going over some of these, what would you say? The background context of the main passage we're about to tackle today shows the direction in which Zarathustra's message is pointing in this part of the book. And so then we'll get on now to the passage, The Convalescent, which begins with Zarathustra, who's returned to his mountain cave where he goes to rest. But he leaps up from his rest and he roars with a loud voice that frightens off all the wild animals living near him on the mountain, with the exception of his own animals, which are his eagle and his serpent. He then says, quote, up, abysmal thought, out of my depth, up, my voice shall crow you awake, end quote. Zarathustra goes on like that for some time, challenging the abysmal thought to show itself. And he shouts and rails against this awful truth deep within him. He finally cries out, quote, I hear you, my abyss speaks. And after repeating the word nausea many times, he declares, woe unto me, and he falls down like one dead. He then remains in a sort of death coma for a long time. And when he finally awakes, he trembles and he shakes and he lays in his cave for a long time. Nietzsche writes that Zarathustra does not eat or drink, and he just sort of lays there catatonic for 7 days. His animals stay with him and watch over Zarathustra as he recovers. One thing you might notice, the way Nietzsche writes this, there might be some parallel to the kind of affliction which struck Nietzsche as a result of his condition regularly. Nietzsche often spent time convalescing from bouts of illness. And so he writes in both the preface to Human All Too Human and to The Gay Science of the process of convalescence, both as a metaphor for intellectual development, as in, we recover from bad ideas the same way we recover from a long illness. But he talks about it, he says it's an illness the way pregnancy is an illness, right? Pregnancy bears offspring for someone, right? But in the old days, they used to consider pregnancy an illness. He describes how in the process of convalescing from an illness, this is like the preface to Human All Too Human, one goes through all sorts of mental and emotional states. And we can only imagine what this was like during Nietzsche's, time period when illness, more often than our own time, could mean death, like a serious bout with illness. And so, Nietzsche, he was one who passed through many different perspectives and ideologies. And then he regards many of his preliminary ideas as long illnesses to get over. And so as a person who also had literal bouts of illness to struggle with, we can say that perhaps he earns the right to use this metaphor as much as he does. And so we have an implicit sort of depiction from Nietzsche's own life in the Convalescence of Zarathustra. But on an allegorical or symbolic level, it seems like Zarathustra dies and is resurrected. Obviously, it's not exactly analogous to someone like Jesus. Jesus was dead for 3 days, according to the gospel. Zarathustra lies mute and dormant for 7 days after being likened to one dead. But we don't need to necessarily compare him to Jesus. We have the example of Mithras or Dionysus. There are lots of gods who die and are reborn. Osiris would be another one. 7 is also very much, repeated number in the Bible. It's a sacred number in a lot of religions. So, while I don't think Zarathustra's resurrection here is supposed to be like a direct correlate with the story of Jesus, I think Nietzsche is crafting a scene in which Zarathustra represents this process of transformation as we've been discussing it, the process of overcoming, and which, ends in giving rise to something new, creating something new. But also that process, it requires something of you, right? You have to, it's your own personal going under and then the dawn of something new. And so I think this is all sort of almost very like esoteric philosophy, really, right? But, and so I think that's why he puts this into a sort of allegorical divine myth and not, Nietzsche mostly writes about this stuff in his notebooks, or in Zarathustra, where he sort of cloaks it in allegory and scenes. Another element here, so Nietzsche often writes, especially in his poetry, of the 7 solitudes. We haven't talked about that concept so much, even though I have mentioned it, because it's even more esoteric. There's a lot of debate as to what it means, because it's a metaphor that Nietzsche often uses but doesn't really define or explain very well. But the concept, I think, directly ties to the idea of convalescence. This is especially in the interpretation of Rohit Sharma. They're a writer and a Germanist, produced a work analyzing the poetry of Friedrich Nietzsche, which is entitled On the Seventh Solitude, Endless Becoming and Eternal Return in the Poetry of Friedrich Nietzsche. So a whole book on the Seventh Solitude. And you may recognize here how Sharma includes in the subtitle Endless Becoming and Eternal Return, which we might say that's like the fundamental metaphysical contradiction that I've been getting at in this episode. Endless becoming resolves itself in the Overman, right? That's how we've come to find endless becoming acceptable, or we find value in it by accepting that we are not to be preserved as we are, but to give rise to something greater. Eternal return resolves itself in amor fati, love of fate, love of life as it is. So how can we resolve love of life as it is with seeing life as a bridge to something greater? And so that's what we've been talking about this whole time, but that contrast is implied by the 2 main concepts of Nietzsche that Sharma puts into his subtitle. So it's only fitting that Nietzsche would explore this element perhaps more thoroughly in poetry, which is a medium better suited than philosophy for oxymorons and juxtaposition of apparently opposite things, mutually exclusive elements, that are nevertheless likened to each other, and striking imagery and all that. So yeah, Sharma comes to an understanding of what the 7th solitude is. It's mentioned several times, as it's mentioned in the connection with the figure of the wanderer in the Gay Science, the passage out of the 7th solitude. Nietzsche also references it in his poem, The Beacon. It could also be, you could translate that poem title as The Fire Sign. It appears just several times across multiple works, but mostly in poetry. One of Sharma's insights is that in the poem The Honey Offering, which is a variation on the poem On the Poverty of the Richest, Zarathustra implies a meaning for the 7th solitude. In the poem, Zarathustra is described as resting, quote, like a creator on his 7th day, end quote. So there's, I think, an immediate intuitive understanding through metaphor of what the 7th solitude is. The solitude of a creator and self-legislator, a creator of new values who's being likened to God here, who has to stand apart from, the common humanity, both literally and figuratively, in order to take on this task And after its completion, there's a sort of necessary rest or convalescence in which the deity-like creator recovers in the same way God rested on the seventh day. And in this time, he stands truly alone, the only being equivalent to himself, the only one who has brought forth this new value, this new creation. And so, you're then alone in your concern for that creation or for the future of it. In the same way that, no one loves your offspring quite like you do, right? And you are alone and having to take care of them. So the creator is alone and having to restore himself to life after having given so much of his life to his creation and all that. It's where one stands between the eternal value they wish to create and the need to live for oneself in one's life today and to come back to life oneself after the creation. That's perhaps why in the poem The Beacon, Zarathustra stands on his ridge between two seas, similar to the scene The Wanderer in Book 3 of Zarathustra, right? On the Isles of the Blessed. This is his ridge between two seas where he attracts new sailors and new adventurers to come up onto the ridge with him. That's what the beacon is, right? Come up into the clouds with Zarathustra. And so he serves as an image and an ideal and a revaluation of values all contained within himself. And in this passage, he does state the seventh solitude. The last line of the poem basically ends with saying, this is my seventh final solitude, my ultimate solitude, you might say. And so convalescence, the final solitude, we could say, it's like the final step of self-transformation, overcoming and giving birth to new things, is an entirely self-contained task. It's a solitary task. And, that carries with it all the hardship and asceticism that might be implied by that. And the final phase where one stands between two seas is where one finally can convalesce and bring themselves back to life. Living again as a result of dying, right? As a result of self-recreation. And so a final note on Sharma's work before we move on. He includes in his book an unpublished note in which Nietzsche actually lists out 7 solitudes. And says what they are. So I guess we'll talk about that really quick. So granted, in a couple other places, Nietzsche also lists 5 solitudes and then 8 solitudes. But 7 is the number that he actually repeats over and over again in his published works. He doesn't ever talk about 8 solitudes. And there's references to the 7th solitude found in Human Ulti Human all the way up to like the Antichrist. And so I'll just read off what Nietzsche's list of 7 solitudes are. 1. Shame and silence before the great thought. 2. Loss of all grounds. 3. Searching. 4. Absence of friends. 5. Highest responsibility. 6. Beyond morality, the perspective of eternity. 7. Convalescence. So what we have here is both a map of what Nietzsche sees as like the self-creative, self-legislative process. So this is the sort of the road of the road of self-creation and self-legislation that the great philosophers such as himself are privy to. But each step is its own form of hardship. So each step brings one closer to oneself or more drawn into oneself, maybe we could say. So we'll just look at each of them in turn. First, shame before the great thought. So I can sort of see that being gripped by an idea. If it's a great thought, it will necessarily run counter to the thoughts of one's age and as such probably be regarded as evil or, untimely. Then losing all ground. So the metaphysical assumptions you previously held drop away, which is alienating, right? Then the process of searching, which is again solitary, wandering for 40 years in the desert of the soul. Absence of friends. That's quite a literal step in the ladder of solitude, isn't it? But we can see how, in Nietzsche's break with Wagner or his split with Ray and Salome, Nietzsche often found himself parting from friends in real life. So he didn't just feel a symbolic or figurative distance from people, but a literal absence of friends. And then highest responsibility. I think this step is the recognition of how a unique responsibility places one apart from other human beings. You become alone in your singular duty, right? And then being beyond morality, the position of eternity. This is the historical perspective, as Nietzsche called it in his early days. that places you beyond good and evil and apart or even against your whole society. We could say set against society. And so then finally, what is the seventh solitude? Convalescence. Seventh day when the Creator rests, looks upon his new creation, and finally comes back to life from this act of self-overcoming. It's like the new dawn. And so this in itself, it's like another mountain to climb. It's another hardship. So there's something very biographical about all these considerations that Sharma finds in Nietzsche's notes and especially in his poems. And so it's, perhaps it's only to be expected somebody with the life of Nietzsche would come to see solitude and being solitary as like the core competency required for greatness. But on the other hand, we also have to think, this is what a very honest expression of what emancipation, looks like. This is emancipation from morality and the sentiments of bound spirits, and how creativity is painful and requires sometimes like introspection to the point of even withdrawing from the world at large sometimes. And so even though it is a bit melodramatic, probably owing to the details of Nietzsche's life, I can kind of, respect what he's doing here. I mean, you have all these sort of like phases of, like in Buddhism and different traditions, like the different steps towards enlightenment, right? I think a certain kind of person needs that. They need that sort of sense of having a map of like where they are psychologically, because their psychological issues can just feel so undefined and vague and hard to explain to people, right? It's like trying to explain how you feel inside with no outside referent or roadmap can be really difficult. But if you have a common language and a common roadmap, you can say to somebody like, oh, I'm kind of going through the long night of the soul, and they kind of know what you mean, right? So I don't know. We're so cynical and ready to dismiss this stuff. I personally love stuff like this. It's very, I don't know. It's Nietzsche doing like world building and mythology. But so in any case, Zarathustra, he's lays comatose for 7 days. The eagle brings Zarathustra all sorts of food, including some lambs that the eagle stole with great difficulty from the shepherds. And finally, after 7 days, Zarathustra awakes, and he smells a rose apple, and then his animals actually speak. And they say, quote, "O Zarathustra, it is now 7 days that you have been lying like this with heavy eyes. Won't you at last get up on your feet again? Step out of your cave. The world awaits you, like a garden. The wind is playing with heavy fragrances that want to get to you, and all the brooks would run after you. All things have been longing for you, while you have remained alone for 7 days. Step out of your cave. All things would be your physicians. Has perhaps some new knowledge come to you, bitter and hard? Like leavened dough you have been lying. Your soul rose and swelled over all its rims." End quote. So Zarathustra, I love the metaphor here. We had the metaphor of ripeness that was used quite a bit earlier in Zarathustra Book 3, that he was finally ripe for his ultimate solitude, where he'll give birth to the idea of eternal recurrence. But here it's that he's a freshly baked loaf of bread. But he's finally ready. He's ready to convalesce, having confronted his most abysmal thought of the eternally recurring smallness of mankind. Remember, that's sort of what we talked about in the second part of the Eternal Return episodes. So after this entreaty to speak, Zarathustra finally tells his animals to quiet down and listen to him, and he speaks to them thus, quote, "To every soul there belongs another world. For every soul, every other soul is an afterworld. Precisely between what is most similar, illusion lies most beautifully, for the smallest cleft is hard to bridge." End quote. So he's talking about the eternal chasm between all subjects, the chasm between my subjective experience and your subjective experience. He's saying this constitutes different worlds that we live in. And so it's very interesting when he first awakes. The first thing Zarathustra, the animals sort of say, come out and greet the world. The world's ready for you again, Zarathustra. Let all things heal you. Let nature heal you. Because, obviously you need healing. We can tell you're convalescing after gaining some new knowledge, right? Some revelation. But it seems like what Zarathustra begins by saying is that he's almost calling into question whether he can give you his truth. Can you really have an insight into what Zarathustra felt or what Nietzsche felt? Or are these, because that's sort of the thing about the praise of solitude, right? And the necessity of solitary wisdom, solitary philosophizing. So in any case, Nietzsche, he rejects the absolute perspective in that we have our given vantage point, whatever it may be. And the second line, he's talking about we get suckered in by the illusion of our perspective being a universal truth. We see the similarity of ourselves to others, right? But the smallest cleft is the hardest to bridge. The equation of unequal things. That's the most difficult flaw in our thinking to overcome, I think, is equating unequal things. So Zarathustra continues, quote, "For me, how should there be any outside myself? There is no outside, but all sounds make us forget this. How lovely it is that we forget. Have not names and sounds been given to things that man might find refreshing? Speaking is a beautiful folly. With that, man dances over all things. How lovely is all talking, and all the deception of sounds. With sounds our love dances on many-hued rainbows." End quote. Zarathustra, I guess, takes a blowtorch to linguistic essentialism, basically immediately leaping to the final conclusion one would draw from the problem that all word concepts equate unequal things. Therefore, word concepts are a folly. They're a beautiful folly owing to the artfulness of our language, but the boundaries we draw around different phenomena are only a matter of perspective, and you can't ever actually bridge the gap between subjective experience. He uses some of the same language that he uses in Only Fool, Only Poet. That was the poem I read an excerpt from around the end of the episode we'd done on the figure of the artist. The poet climbs on deceptive word bridges, right? Through the use of oratory, we express our own truth, but it's not a complete view of objective reality. And so Zarathustra, I think he's preparing us or Nietzsche is preparing us here for the fact that, he's standing between two seas atop of his ridge, right? The unification of art and philosophy, the recognition of this fact of the basic incompleteness of any perspective, the daring to create values in spite of this fact, holding those things simultaneously in his mind. And, it's worth bringing up a coinage from the previous section, the Old and New Tablets, that no truth should ever be forged without the occasion for a laugh, I believe he says. So Zarathustra's animals then answer him, quote, "O Zarathustra, to those who think as we do, all things themselves are dancing. They come and offer their hands and laugh and flee and come back. Everything goes, everything comes back. Eternally rolls the wheel of being. Everything dies, everything blossoms again. Eternally runs the year of being. Everything breaks, everything is joined anew. Eternally the same house is being built. Everything parts, everything greets every other thing again. Eternally the ring of being remains faithful to itself. In every now being begins. Round every here rolls the sphere, there. The center is everywhere. Bent is the path of eternity." End quote. So it's more or less a restatement of eternal return from Zarathustra's Animals. It's a passage that I think bears at least some resemblance to, what is Solomon's exclamation, "There's nothing new under the sun," and the surrounding verses there, "What has been shall be again," and so on and so forth. But it's a very serene and beautiful passage, but Zarathustra replies by saying, "Oh, you buffoons and barrel organs." And he says this to his animals and smiles as he does so. And he goes on to reference the vision and riddle, which we discussed earlier this season. Quote, "How well you know what had to be fulfilled in 7 days, and how that monster crawled down my throat and suffocated me. But I bit off its head and spewed it out. And you, have you already made a hurdy-gurdy song of this?" End quote. So he's saying that what the vision and the riddle symbolized is the psychic or psychological process that Zarathustra has just gone through, that he has bit through the abysmal thought of eternal return and spit it out. And he's saying, what a horrible suffering I've had to endure. You know, how the animals are, he goes on to say how the animals are quite cruel for making up a song. They've watched Zarathustra suffer, only to make up some honeyed words about the whole affair. They've watched his suffering and generated this lyric poem. And so he goes on to compare his own convalescence after the challenge that he's faced, of fighting against his own abysmal thought, to like tragedies, bullfights, or crucifixions, which is to say public displays of suffering. How it's a human, all too human thing to enjoy the depictions of suffering. So even you, my animals, are you this cruel as well? But of course he says that whole thing with a smile, and we know of Nietzsche's love of tragedy, right? So I think this is irony here. It's a desire to poke fun at the supposed seriousness of the whole affair, the seriousness of the problem of eternal return, like the solemnity that one might interpret into Zarathustra's death and resurrection. It's just another suffering in life's grand tragic drama. No need to write a song about it. And whereas Zarathustra might have had a solemn seriousness before his convalescence, now with the forging of a new truth, a new creation, he does it with a smile and some irony and some good humor, right? I think there's a great deal of good humor throughout the book. This dovetails directly into what Zarathustra says next, which is to criticize the instinct for feeling pity for the higher man, the great person, people like himself. He writes, quote, "When the great man screams, the small man comes running with his tongue hanging from lasciviousness, but he calls it his pity." End quote. So there's a sexual element to that image there. It's another way of reducing our supposedly higher virtues to mere expressions of base instincts. So Zarathustra follows this utterance with, quote, "The small man, especially the poet, how eagerly he accuses life with words," end quote. So what we see here is some of the same. He's explaining the source of his hesitation that Zarathustra felt at preaching the doctrine of eternal recurrence in the first place. I think it's the source of much of Zarathustra's hesitation at giving his teachings, whenever these hesitations come up, because the ultimate measure for Zarathustra is whether his teachings are an inducement to life and to living. The danger he's concerned of is the danger of making an accusation against life, making a teaching that's taken for a condemnation of life, or worse, is warped and misinterpreted into such a condemnation for someone else's ends. And so we're starting to see why Zarathustra's first words upon passing through this seventh ultimate solitude are to sort of thumb his nose at the effectiveness of words themselves, or the importance or even the possibility of really truly explaining this great insight that he's gained. He basically has to be pried into speaking by his animals. And it's the animals that do most of the expression of the grand doctrines of eternal return and the Overman that Zarathustra's been preaching throughout the book. After his convalescence, he lets the animals speak and mostly just tells them to be quiet, right? So Zarathustra continues, quote, "I myself, do I thus want to be man's accuser? Alas, my animals, only this have I learned so far, that man needs what is most evil in him for what is best in him, that whatever is most evil is his best power and the hardest stone for the highest creator, and that man must become better and more evil. My torture was not the knowledge that man is evil, but I cried as no one has yet cried, alas, that his greatest evil is still so very small. Alas, that his best is so very small. The great disgust with man, this choked me and had crawled into my throat, and what the soothsayer said, all is the same, nothing is worthwhile, knowledge chokes. A long twilight limped before me, a sadness, weary to death, drunken with death, speaking with a yawning mouth. Eternally recurs the man of whom you were so weary, the small man. thus yawned my sadness and dragged its feet and could not go to sleep. End quote. And I'm going to skip a little further down in the passage where he reiterates, quote, alas, man recurs eternally. The small man recurs eternally. Naked I had once seen both, the greatest man and the smallest man, all too similar to each other, even the greatest all too human, all too small the greatest. That was my disgust with man. And the eternal recurrence even of the smallest, that was my disgust with all existence. Alas, nausea, nausea, nausea. End quote. And so this should all be fairly clear with the setup that we've done. I would hope this passage would be perfectly comprehensible to you. And in fact, Nietzsche is having Zarathustra reiterate what he's even said earlier in the book. The greatest man and the smallest man, he finds all too human. Only the meaning here, earlier I drew on that passage where we found it earlier in the book, in book 2, to sort of bring up that he is not saying that any figure in history has ever been an Übermensch. But here, the implication is much different, right? That the fact that no human being that's ever lived has ever been an Übermensch was his, that was his condemnation of man, his disgust with reality. That was the great nausea that he experienced. That was the black snake he had to bite through. That was the most abysmal thought. So, trace the dialogue so far from what the animals proclaimed when Zarathustra awoke to what he's saying now. The animals give a voice to this synthesis of endless flux and eternal repetition. All things arise, all things pass away, but things never cease to arise, they never cease to pass away. All that has been will occur again, all goes and all returns. But alas, that's not what troubles Zarathustra. He makes it clear what his abysmal thought is. He says it's not the dominion of death which Christ came to conquer. It's not the problem of impermanence which troubled the Buddha. It's the smallness of mankind. The smallness that exists even in the greatest people who have ever lived. That smallness is eternal also, if eternal return is to be our great faith, right? So we have the invocation of the vision and the riddle, which is the story we told in episode 26, about biting through the nauseating thought of man's eternal smallness. And the vision ends with the transformation of what was a mere shepherd into this glowing, shining being, this being who laughs as no man has ever laughed on earth before. And so in that allegorical tale, we have the metaphor and outline. Eternal recurrence is the ultimate test, right? It's the ultimate challenge. The Overman is the solution to that challenge. One has to have faith in the generative, transformative ability of mankind. Have faith that the greatest potential of man is so great that it justifies the smallness. But Zarathustra is here so overcome again with nausea from his remembrance of the abysmal thought, the animals stop him. The passage continues, quote, thus spoke Zarathustra and sighed and shuddered, for he remembered his sickness. But then his animals would not let him go on. Do not speak on, O convalescent, but go out where the world awaits you like a garden. Go out to the roses and bees and dovecots, but especially to the songbirds, that you may learn from them how to sing. For singing is for the convalescent. The healthy can speak, and when the healthy man also wants songs, he wants different songs from the convalescent. "O you buffoons and barrel organs, be silent," Zarathustra replied, and smiled at his animals. "How well you know what comfort I invented for myself in 7 days. That I must sing again, this comfort and convalescence I invented for myself. Must you immediately turn this too into a hurdy-gurdy song?" End quote. So he silences the animals with the same refrain. They're just buffoons making noise, right? And again, he doesn't deny what the animals are saying. We can see the smile and the hint of irony here. But the animals sound a bit like Eckhart Tolle, we might say. In fact, I think that's exactly the story of Eckhart Tolle. He just recovered from a long illness, go back and get back in touch with nature. Go live in the moment, right? Indulge in the wholesome pleasures of life once more, of singing and dancing. And these are all things that Zarathustra so often praises. And I think this is where we're getting into the weeds with interpretation, so take this for what you will. But I think it's because Zarathustra is, out of the seventh solitude, he's keenly aware of how such words can be misunderstood or turned into something they're not. Nietzsche is placing all of the characters' immediate monologuing about his triumph over the abysmal thought, his new regained health, into the mouths of his instincts, and having his conscious mind say, well, let's just hush about that, right? Because that's the Zarathustra in this scene, that's the part of him that's the conscious rational judge. He thinks better than to say anything about all this, lest people take a one-sided interpretation, right? Momentism, immediate moment is what matters. But that's what I think the animals saying it, that's what his instincts are saying. His animals don't stay quiet. They actually then talk for the rest of the passage. And we can sort of imagine them speaking as a sort of like animal chorus, right? The eagle and the serpent, announcing in perhaps naive terms the consolation which Zarathustra gained in his convalescence, something which Zarathustra's conscious self does not wish to speak of. Something he has better sense than to speak of, because he knows he can't ever really truly convey it to you. That's what he's been saying the whole time. I can't really truly convey this through words. But the animals do it anyway, because that's Nietzsche's instinct is to write this and give it to the world in an artistic form. And so I'm going to read the final soliloquy by the animals in a somewhat abridged form, but I'm going to read pretty much the entirety all the way through to the end of the passage. Quote, "Sing and overflow, O Zarathustra, cure your soul with new songs, that you may bear your great destiny, which has never yet been any man's destiny. For your animals know well, O Zarathustra, who you are and must become. Behold, you are the teacher of the eternal recurrence. That is your destiny. That you as the first must teach this doctrine. How could this great destiny not be your greatest danger and sickness too? Behold, we know what you teach, that all things recur eternally, and we ourselves too, and that we have already existed an eternal number of times, and all things with us. You teach that there is a great year of becoming, a monster of a great year, which must, like an hourglass, turn over again and again, so that it may run down and run out again. And all these years are alike in what is greatest as in what is smallest, and we ourselves are alike in every year, in what is greatest as in what is smallest. And if you wanted to die now, O Zarathustra, behold, we also know how you would then speak to yourself. But your animals beg you not to die yet. You would speak without trembling, but breathing deeply with happiness, for a great weight and sultriness would be taken from you who are most patient. Now I would die and vanish, you would say, and all at once I am nothing. The soul is as mortal as the body, but the knot of causes in which I am entangled recurs and will create me again. I myself belong to the causes of the eternal recurrence. I come again with this sun, with this earth, with this eagle, with this serpent, not to a new life, or a better life, or a similar life. I come back eternally to this same, self-same life. In what is greatest as in what is smallest, to teach again the eternal recurrence of all things, to speak again the word of the great noon of earth and man, to proclaim the Overman again to men. I spoke my word, I break of my word, thus my eternal lot wants it. As a proclaimer, I perish. The hour has now come when he who goes under should bless himself. Thus ends Zarathustra's going under." When the animals had spoken these words, they were silent and waited for Zarathustra to say something to them. But Zarathustra did not hear that they were silent. Rather, he lay still with his eyes closed, like one sleeping, although he was not asleep, for he was conversing with his soul. The serpent, however, and the eagle, when they found him thus silent, honored the great stillness around them and cautiously stole away. End quote. And so, throughout this, we have a statement about the eternal return and the repetition of the greatest and the smallest, and of the justification of the eternal recurrence of what is small by the eternal recurrence of what is great. But more than that, what we have is It's an explication of how Zarathustra himself is going under, the same way the tightrope walker went under in one of the first scenes of the book, or in the way that the sun sets. Zarathustra has lived dangerously by preaching this doctrine of eternal return. He's dared to teach the most perilous doctrine to men by releasing his abysmal thought on the world. This is Zarathustra's greatness. He's the advocate of the circuit, the teacher of the circle, the prophet of eternal return, and having thus lived in this manner and subjected himself to all the torments and tortures of this terrible thought and all the hardships of solitude, he's made danger his vocation, and he can die in peace. The hour has come when he who goes under should bless himself. And so, by doing this, that's Zarathustra's way of being a bridge to the Overman. And as such, we can draw a conclusion about how Nietzsche saw his own life and his own commitment to living in the pursuit of the will to power, and thus remaining faithful to the earth. By taking on these dangerous questions and daring to raise such challenging philosophical doctrines, Nietzsche has lived dangerously in his own way. He's opened himself up to misunderstanding and misappropriation of his ideas, to being mocked or aped, he even predicts it, or to being mistaken for man's accuser. But having done his great task and met it with bravery, Zarathustra can then die well. He can die knowing death is not the end, for nothing ever really ends. The fact that the smallness is forever counterbalanced by the greatness that is forever, and that greatness, while ever off in the future, is realized, paradoxically, in the lives of those who go under for the sake of their great loves and their great quests in life. And Nietzsche then has illustrated this by suffering in solitude for the sake of his truths. I'm going to include at the end here just some commentary from one of the great commenters on Nietzsche. Love him or hate him, Walter Kaufmann. I've noticed a lot more people criticizing Kaufmann recently, but everyone seems to acknowledge his translations are generally very good. But, and I want to stress, I'm not going to agree with maybe the way Kaufmann puts all of this. I have some actually staunch disagreements with him. But I'll just read some of what he has to say about how the Overman and Eternal Recurrence ideas work together, because he's one of the sort of pioneers of that interpretation. And he puts it very well in his book on Nietzsche, subtitled Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. This is page 316. Quotes: "When the Übermensch is thus understood, the conception not only does not conflict with the doctrine of eternal recurrence, but the essential connection between the two ideas becomes clear. As a matter of fact, the seedlings of the two can be found close together even before Zarathustra in the second meditation." End quote. Oh, and for that, you can look up the episode we did on that essay called Use and Abuse of History for Life. The episode's entitled the same as the essay. Kaufmann then goes on in this next paragraph that I want to read from to give a very concise explanation. And there is an aspect in this one that I staunchly disagree with, but I'll address that after reading it. This is on page 320. Quote: "The doctrine of the eternal recurrence of all things has been referred to previously as the Dionysian faith. The man, Nietzsche chose Goethe as his representative, who has organized the chaos of his passions and integrated every feature of his character, redeeming even the ugly by giving it a meaning in a beautiful totality. This Übermensch would also realize how inextricably his own being was involved in the totality of the cosmos, and in affirming his own being, he would also affirm all that is, has been, or will be. Elsewhere, Nietzsche notes, thereupon Zarathustra related out of the joy of the Übermensch the secret that all recurs." End quote. Okay, so Kaufmann seems to believe and assert at various points in the writing that when Nietzsche is talking about the Übermensch, he's actually talking on some level about historical individuals that may have fit the bill, and he mentions Goethe here. I'm a bit baffled by this, honestly, because Nietzsche and Zarathustra deny it several times. But perhaps to take a charitable reading, we might say, so if self-creation is Nietzsche's ideal, Kaufmann here is describing a self-creating individual, and perhaps figures such as Goethe, whom Nietzsche does roundly praise, are the closest approximation of that ideal we get. Like we might say, to use blasphemously Platonic language, the Übermensch is the form of the great person, right? The idea of the great person, the idea. And while no great person can be a perfect Übermensch, they could approximate it to various degrees. But the important part, the reason why I wanted to read this, is Kaufman's interpretation here includes the idea of accepting the eternity of all things, taking on the entirety of existence as necessarily directly correlating with the degree to which one is self-creating and a self-legislator. The key phrase that Kaufman zeroes in on, that it is out of the joy of the Overman that Zarathustra gains the strength to preach the doctrine that all recurs. The eternality of the Overman ideal makes eternal return acceptable. And to whatever degree we might argue, or I might quibble with Kaufman about whether the ideal is actually realized in man or not, I think we could agree on that at least. And so Kaufman then brings up the passage we cited in episode 26 in our examination of Eternal Recurrence, which is the drunken song. That's one of the most important parts of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it of course ends with the line, quote, "Joy wants the eternity of all things, wants deep eternity," end quote. And I'll read Kaufman's comment on this poem on page 321 as follows, quote, "This is the ultimate apotheosis of the supra-historical outlook, the supreme exaltation of the moment. Negatively, the doctrine of eternal recurrence is the most extreme repudiation of any deprecation of the moment, the finite and the individual, the antithesis of any faith in infinite progress, whether it be evolution, Faust's unbounded striving, or the endless improvement of the human soul in Kant's conception of immortality," end quote. So I don't know if I would phrase it in exactly those terms. But again, that element does exist of honoring the finite, right? Making every finite thing eternal. And that obviates the need for anything like progress. It's the eternality of the present, the eternal value of all fleeting things. And I would point out, as in Rohit Sharma's sort of progress towards the seventh ultimate solitude, the sixth one, where you're beyond good and evil, is the perspective of eternity, right? And so we might even say that from the perspective of eternity, the difference between past and present and future, I think that's something that Kaufman's kind of getting at, is that sort of disappears, right? And so it sort of resolves slices through that Gordian knot in that way. But on the other side of that coin, there's the downside we mentioned at the outset, towards which the Overman ideal serves as a counterbalance. This is on page 327, quoting Kaufman, final time. Quote, "The doctrine means that all events are repeated endlessly and that there is no plan nor goal to give meaning to history or life, and that we are mere puppets in an absolutely senseless play. The eternal recurrence is the epitome of a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. In a note for Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, 'After the vision of the Overman, in a gruesome way, the doctrine of recurrence, now bearable,' end quote. And so I think Kaufman gives a good picture of what he's calling the religion of the Dionysian. That, as we've said, the eternal recurrence is the great test, the great challenge, and the way of biting through it is the Overman. This is by no means my final word on the matter. I think there's a great deal more that we could explore in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There's more to say on the topic of Nietzsche's religious and artistic projects as well. But I think that with this episode in the Nietzsche Podcast, we're kind of hitting a milestone because we've more or less touched on all the key points of Nietzsche's ideas, in my view, with the exception of politics, which we're going to save mostly for next season. But, in a sense, that's where the fun begins, because from here we here at the podcast, or even you yourself as you read Nietzsche on your own, you can begin to delve more deeply into the nuances and to the nooks and crannies of Nietzsche's philosophy. You can explore the apparent and the very real contradictions and view them for what they really reveal about Nietzsche's broader thought, because now you have the context of all the major ideas and how they actually all work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. And I think now we can start getting more deeply into interpretation and competing ideas about Nietzsche's work. Or at least I'll feel more comfortable getting into that. I still have a lot of influences that I want to cover, influences on Nietzsche, but I think now I'll be a little more open to cover those Nietzsche influenced. I don't know exactly when, but now would be the time where I'm going to be a little more open to that. Thank you to all of you, especially my patrons, for making this show possible. As I record this, it's the morning of the day that I'm leaving for the open road. I know I've mentioned it before, but my band is going on tour for the first time in 2 years, which was something I did for 8 years before the pandemic. So it's been a huge change in my life. And the podcast probably would never have happened if the pandemic hadn't happened. So amor fati, right? Let's be grateful for our mishaps. I'll be sure to check in with everyone as my journey continues. If you've been following my YouTube channel, you probably will have already seen some updates or uploads that I've surely will have made by now by the time this episode comes out, which is going to be, I think, a good 2 weeks from now. But however this whole venture goes, I'm just happy to be out in the thick of it again after such a long period of dormancy. So I'm about to go live dangerously, everyone. So wish me luck. Thanks again. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.